The One Democratic State initiative speaks of a democratic Palestinian state, but it also speaks of a secular state. And this raises some questions because the resistance in Palestine, so those spearheading the liberation movement at the moment, are predominantly Islamic. So this raises really valid questions that I will try to discuss. First of all, what does secularism mean in an Islamic context or Islamist context? And second of all, because the purpose of analysis is never to just, increase academic knowledge, but to take action, what can we do, whether we are Palestinians or not, with regards to this? So first of all, what is secularism? What does it mean in the context we're discussing? My comrade Juliette discussed the definition of secularism, the concept of a political movement or vision or state that is neutral to people's religious identities, and the broader concept of depoliticizing identities, which is a concept and an expression we borrowed from Mahmoud Mamdani, so Zohran's father, and the concept of not granting or denying rights on the basis of identity. And many times in our countries, people object to the word secularism, علمانية, and there are reasons why they object. First of all, it's tied to the colonial powers of Europe and the US, because they claim to be secular, and if this is secularism, we don't want it. So it's associated with colonialism. Many times it's even associated with Israel itself. Like, many people think that Israel is a secular state because this is part of the propaganda we hear, and so it's associated with this set of values, including the word secularism. And so, this is one reason why the word is refused. Oftentimes it's associated with atheism and Islamophobia, so like the policies that Juliette described happening in France, so that also something that we resist. And also because secular Arab regimes have been horrible to their peoples, to Islamic movements, and even in terms of collaboration with Israel, like the so-called Palestinian Authority. This reminds me of a Palestinian 2 days ago who was curious and left a comment on our social media page asking, how do you speak of secularism and resistance? You're secular, you side with compromise. So this is the mental associations we have with the word, and it explains why the word is completely refused by Islamic movements and people. What about the concept? Interestingly, many of the different elements of the concept of secularism and of depoliticizing identities are elements that can be accepted by Islamists. And by saying this, I'm not defending Islamism, nor am I attacking it. I'm just objectively trying to understand or analyze what it actually means. So obviously there's not one kind of Islamism, just like there's not a single kind of secularism or whatever, or socialism or capitalism or liberalism or so on. It's a whole spectrum, and across the spectrum different elements of secularism will be accepted. This brings us to understanding key differences between Islamism and Zionism, because some might feel that we want neither Islamism nor Zionism, we want something in the middle that is secularism. And although I don't want Islamism either, I absolutely disagree with this frame. It's a completely false equivalency, and there are several reasons for this. First of all, when Hamas and Islamic Jihad speak of Islamism, they're talking as Palestinians of a way to administer affairs in Palestine. So it's not a settler colonial project where they are planning to invade Madagascar, ethnically raise its population, install an Islamic state, and then grant citizenship to all the Muslims of the world. So the concept that this is a Palestinian project, whereas that is a settler colonial project, is key, and this is why there is no equivalency between the two. The second idea is the amount of tolerance that is embedded in Islamism. And by saying this, I'm not doing the apology of Islamism. I'm just analyzing objectively as it is, even given all of my disagreements with it. Even in the first charter of Hamas, which is they call the most Islamist one, it clearly stated that we have no problem with Jews or Jewish religion, and inside the Islamic state that we want to create, they can remain and freedom of worship will be respected. So again, we can disagree with their vision, but it's important to understand that it's not comparable to Zionism in terms of how it will deal with others. And this is one, you remember I said there are different elements of secularism or of depoliticizing identity. This element, which is allowing others to live and practice their religion, it is also there. If you read the second manifesto of Hamas, if you read the manifesto of the Islamic Jihad, if you read the statements of leaders of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, although again, I don't agree with everything in these statements and with many other things of theirs, otherwise I would be a member of Hamas, not of the initiative, you will notice that in many cases that say that yes, we don't want to discriminate on the basis of identity. In an interview with Mohammed al-Hindi, who is the second in command in the Islamic Jihad, he said the problem is not about religion. Even if Netanyahu today were to become a Muslim, he would still be an occupier. And he said the problem is not Jews living among us, the problem is Jewish supremacy. So obviously the main obstacle to Zionism is not a problem in Islamism, it's a problem in Zionism. So this is something that needs to be understood. This brings us to a question, which is, can they accept other elements, like deeper elements of secularism? Even if they don't accept the word, but can they actually accept the concept? I think it's important here to have a correct understanding of how things happen. Obviously, people choose a certain path, a certain vision, their identity plays a role, but material conditions are key. So I'll give an example. Hamas has several times said that it's willing to accept a state on the borders of 1967. So, okay, this is incompatible with a vision for an Islamic state, but it has stated this. Hezbollah in Lebanon a few years ago declared that it was fine to recognize the rights of Israel. So why did they do this? They did this because of the balance of power. So in practice, just like any other movement, it's not that they have some kind of absolutes that inevitably forges their path forward. They react to the balance of power. Even the predominance of Islamist movements is a reaction to geopolitical balances of power. So for example, when it was mainly the Soviet Union that was funding the resistance was mainly secular. Later on, when the Soviet Union fell and there was the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and Iran started funding the revolution, funding the resistance took an Islamist color, we say in Arabic. It became Islamist. And obviously, if something happens to the Islamic Republic in Iran and eventually it's China who's funding, things will change again. And so it's important when we discuss, can they accept it? Not to view things as, a predestined fate, but to understand that, like any other movements, they react to the balance of power. And this leads to the second question of the talk, which is, what can we do? So, what can we do to affect the balance of power in a way that that is closer to our vision? So I'll speak of first what can Palestinians do, and second what can non-Palestinians do. Regarding Palestinians, I think there are two things we can do. One of them is to bridge the gap, and the second is to manage the gap. So when it comes to bridging the gap, we need to understand the elements of secularism, and we need to engage in conversations with Islamists to try to understand where exactly do we disagree and where don't we disagree. What are things that at the moment they can accept, and what are things that at the moment they cannot accept. And also on our side, what are things that we can tolerate and things that we cannot tolerate and need to really rev up the effort against. So this is one aspect, bridging the gap by means of discussions. Once we understand where we are at, we can deal with the gap, we can manage the gap. And so an example of this that I can think of is the resistance in France. Part of it was capitalist, part of it was socialist, and at some points they bridged the gap. So for example, in France after liberation, they were very strong unions, but in some other aspects they did not bridge the gap, but they managed to work together. And this is in the conference that we had in Beirut, which preceded this one. 3 weeks ago. One of the guests was Salah, who is one of the founders of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And he discussed this issue, and he said, well, very simply, secular forces and Islamist forces need to reach a common agreement on the kind of state that we want to see. And to be able to have this discussion and to be able to impose some of the terms and to negotiate some of the terms, then obviously we need to become a strong enough political movement so that we can actually have a say in this discussion. So this is what Palestinians should do, increase in strength so they can have a discussion to bridge the gap and manage the gap. And what about non-Palestinians? Because many will say, okay, that's great if you as a Palestinian organization does that, but what about us? I think there are several things that can be done. First of all, of course, you cannot tell Palestinians what to do, and even Palestinians cannot tell Palestinians what to do. I mean, if a Palestinian is an Islamist, we can discuss, but that's the end of it. They have to make their own decision at the end of the day. But on one hand, you can state your point of view. So, for example, I think that if you give me the name of any state, if you speak of Ecuador or Myanmar or Mongolia or Madagascar that I was just quoting, I think it should be a secular state. I'm not imposing anything on people but I can have and state an opinion. That's one point. A second point is that there are universal values. So when it comes to democracy, it's democracy is what people's need to actually decide of their future. So if we want Palestinians to decide of their future, then they should have a secular state. And this is something that we can all work for. We don't need to wait for someone to actually say, I want to be able to speak freely. We can say that, all humans should have that right. So there are universal concepts that we can stand with. We don't need to be Palestinians to do that. So if you say there shouldn't be any occupying state in Palestine, it should be a Palestinian state, and if you add it shouldn't discriminate on the basis of religion, you're just saying what probably you would say about any other state in the world. So you're eliminating colonial exceptionalism by saying there should be a democratic Palestinian state, and inside that state, Palestinians will decide what to do. And finally, you can support the organizations that are closer to your vision. So imagine there's an earthquake and there are different kinds of organizations working on the ground. Some are helping women, some are helping children and educating them, some are, in the rebuilding work, and you feel closer to helping the rebuilding work, then, you will focus your efforts there. It's your right to do that. You're not saying the others shouldn't do their job. You're just, focusing on the area. And so if you think that our vision for a secular Palestinian state is one that aligns with you, then simply, don't impose anything on Palestinians, but engage in the work of the initiative either by joining us or by coordinating efforts with us. So all in all, this is, I think, what I have to say about secularism in an Islamic context. They have a problem with the word, but they have no problem with elements of the concept. Palestinians need to engage in discussions to bridge and manage the gap, and allies everywhere can help us do that.